Thank you for tuning in to the Northeast region's headquarters for hunting-related stories and tactics, sourced from DIY hunters and industry insiders. This is Hunting the Empire. Now here's your host, Joe Mainville.
Hey everybody, Joe here. Welcome to another episode of Hunting the Empire podcast. I want to thank you for taking the time to tune in. Got a great episode coming up for you here, but I wanted to touch on a little bit of housekeeping first. If this is your first time coming to the podcast, I encourage you to go back and listen to some older episodes. There's a lot of great information available. I've also got a lot more episodes coming at you with a bunch of awesome guests that I think everybody's really going to like. There's also a link available in the show notes section of the podcast that'll direct you to the new website. I've tried to make it pretty easy for everybody to find the information that they're looking for. On the right-hand side of the website, you'll see a link called Categories, and with that Categories tab, you'll be able to look up information on basically classifying each episode to kind of what topic you're looking for, or what topic maybe in a previous episode that you'd like to touch on. So if you're looking for public land information or private land information, or how to hunt bedding areas, or how to play thermals, I'm going to be classifying all of the new episodes through these categories to make it super easy for people to go back and reference some of that stuff and brush up on some of those skills. Again, I wanted to take this time to welcome you to the show. I'm glad that you've tuned in. We've got a bunch of new episodes coming out. Right now, I plan on having new episodes roll out every Tuesday. I encourage you to please subscribe and add Hunting the Empire to your favorite RSS feed or add it to your iTunes playlist. I've got some guests coming up that you're not going to want to miss. On the show today, I'm joined by Reuben Dourte, also known as the Common Ground Bowhunter. I think there's a little bit of information in this episode for everybody. Reuben and I talk from everything from bedding to cover to thermals and wind, and even how he uses trail cameras to hunt. So without any more delay, here we go. All right, so on the line with me today, I've got Reuben Dourte, also known as the Common Ground Bowhunter. Reuben, how you doing today?
I'm doing all right. How about yourself?
I'm doing very well, thank you. I guess I want to have you introduce yourself to the audience a little bit. If you could kind of tell us what you do for a living and what you primarily hunt and what got you into hunting.
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks for having me on today. I'm happy to be talking to you. I think we'll have a good conversation here. So, for a living, I sell insurance. So I always say I'm one of those guys that gets lumped in with the bankers and the lawyers. But I've been in the family business for about 5.5, going on 6 years now. And my great-grandfather started our agency. It's been in our family since 1943. So that's what I do from 8 to 5. And as far as any kind of hobbies and stuff, obviously wouldn't be talking to you if hunting wasn't one of them. But between work and hunting with a young family, my kids are 2 and 10 months old. There's really not a whole heck of a lot of time for anything really outside of that. So you kind of pick and choose, what you can find time for. And hunting is one of my priorities after family, of course. So that's kind of what takes my time outside of that.
Yeah, fair enough. That's awesome. How long have you been hunting? What got you into it?
I started when I was 12, which before the mentor program in Pennsylvania, that was like the earliest age that you could start hunting and carrying a weapon. I did walk along with my dad for a turkey season. Before that, I was probably about 10 or so. And I would remember walking through the woods, and a nice little basket 6-point buck ran up to me when we were walking through the woods, turkey hunting. And that experience kind of, like, I can still picture it in my head today, but I just couldn't wait to get out into the woods and go deer hunting after experiencing that. And my dad always was just a rifle hunter, and my grandfather as well. They never had a bow or picked up any kind of archery equipment. But I always felt like when I was younger, the first year that I was hunting, I felt like that, how do I want to say, the odds that you are afforded in Pennsylvania reduced drastically after about 12 noon on the first day of gun season, and after that it diminishes drastically if you're going to get a buck, let alone a nice buck. And so I was looking for ways to maximize my time in the timber, and it seemed like archery hunting would be a way to do that. And at that point in time, archery hunting was kind of on an uptick, but there wasn't near the numbers of archery hunters in the woods as there is today. So I had some small pieces of ground that was around where I lived in South Central Pennsylvania that I could go and I could hunt, and I would be the only person on, and I could go and make my mistakes and learn, kind of just from that trial and error process on those pieces, without as much influence in those early season days from other hunters like what you have in the rifle season. The deer are all running scared. It's kind of mayhem in the northern tier of Pennsylvania in gun season, and even now it is, but back then it was even crazier because it was so much more, it's brown, it's down, even than what it is now. So I thought, I can go and hunt these deer with archery equipment a little more stealthy. If I go in and I'm not successful, that spot's not necessarily completely burnt out. I'm not putting all my eggs in this one basket of the first 4 hours of daylight on opening day. And so that was what kind of like bore the whole like archery passion that I have now.
Yeah, that's awesome. As a hunter from central New York, there's a lot of similarities to how my
Oh yeah.
hunting's evolved over the years as well. Being New York and Pennsylvania are definitely some high pressure states, and
Mm-hmm.
I kind of got into archery late in life too. And one of the reasons was to try to extend my season where I didn't see as many people.
Exactly.
So
Yep.
yeah,
And
definitely.
it's getting a little bit harder to get away from people even in archery season. On public ground, or even some of the private ground that I hunt now that's shared, like when I was initially hunting up there, when I would take my bow equipment, I could get my dad to take me up for one weekend in either in the last weekend in October or the first weekend in November. And there was some small game hunting that was in at that point in time. And some of the guys that gun hunted with us, they would be hunting small game, and I would go and take my climber and sit in a tree stand and archery hunt. Now it's kind of shifted where it seems like the people who share those properties, there's probably about 5 or 6 or so other archery hunters now that were 15 years ago. It was just me. I had the whole place to myself. So it is shifting, I think, a little bit. But.
Interesting. What So I know you've mentioned that you hunt in PA and you hunt in New York. Are those primarily the two, or what states do you do most of your hunting in?
Yeah, those are the primary two. Now that I live back in Pennsylvania, I did live out in Southwest Michigan, for 5 or so years, and I hunted Michigan when I was out there. Like I said, the southwestern portion of the state. So um, Battle Creek, below Battle Creek and below Grand Rapids, if somebody wants to look at a map, like that corner of the state was where I lived and spent my time, and the public ground that I walked was, in that quadrant of the state. And that's high hunter density too. Like Michigan might not show that there's as many hunters per square mile as Pennsylvania. Like Pennsylvania, I think the last survey was 20.5 hunters per square mile. I think New York was 15 and a half or something like that, or 15.9. Michigan might be lower, but you have to remember that out there, so much of the the square mileage in the state is water. So that's a huge portion of the state is water. And then you also have a huge chunk of ground in the Upper Peninsula that is low deer density and probably a lower hunter density up there than the more populated southern half of the state. So it's not like a consistent pressure across the whole state, I guess I would say, and the deer density isn't consistent across the whole state. So in that southern half of the state, it's it feels, the hunting pressure feels a lot like New York or Pennsylvania.
Now, given those kind of pressure differences and the deer density differences in kind of thinking about New York, Pennsylvania, and Michigan being, I guess, more considered, I don't know, the upper Midwest,
Mm-hmm.
are your tactics different when you hunt those different states or when you've hunted them in the past? Or do you find similarities when you're out there hunting whitetails, that there's definitely things that still, remain the same, or given terrain differences or just deer behavior differences, do you have to go about it a little differently, or?
Yeah, the terrain is definitely hugely different between Michigan and New York and Pennsylvania. Where I hunt in New York and Pennsylvania, excuse me, is mostly hunt the northern tier of Pennsylvania and the southern tier of New York. And so I'm jumping back and forth across the state line, and the topography is basically exactly the same. Now, if you get down into central Pennsylvania or even south central Pennsylvania where I live, you have more of, I'll call it rolling farm country, where cover is more limited. The central most part of the state, you'll have the big woods timber in Pennsylvania, and probably up around where you are, there could be some patches of some big woods in New York, which would be north of where I'm at. But I'm mostly hunting like uh, kind of like long ridge lines that have blocks of timber on them that are broken up by ag and CRP. And most of them, if you think of it kind of like, um, if you have parallel ridge lines in the valley, there's a road in almost every valley, and then you'll have a ridge line that's just long and parallel to the road with a block of timber on that, and then where it flattens out in the bottom between the hill and the road in that valley, you'll have the ag, and then sometimes you'll have ag fields on the end like of the ridge line. I guess if I'm maybe not describing that exactly correct, but a lot of the timber blocks where I'm hunting will be 40 to, I'll say, 120 acres. Whereas if you get into central Pennsylvania public on state forest ground, you're talking, north of 20,000 acres of nothing but timber. And then to describe where I was at in Michigan, it was mostly flat ground. There's some gently rolling hills, but it's almost all flat. A lot of marsh country, a lot of swamp ground, dogwood, tamarack, some cattail, and then there's a tremendous amount of ag, but they have huge, expansive ag fields, and then they have kind of some irregular timber blocks that are mostly situated around the wetland areas. So you'll have a piece of timber with some high ground. There might be some swamp attached to it. There might be what I call kettles through the timber, where they're just kind of little gently rolling humps of high ground. The deer like to bed on them. They might only be 4 foot difference in elevation. They'll sit up on top of them just to get a little better vantage. So it's incredibly different, but more cover funnels out in Michigan, and little skinny pinch point necks of woods connecting to bigger pieces, or a swamp pinching down a piece, coming up and pinching down a piece of timber as the swamp pushes up to the field edge or something like that, and it kind of creates a travel corridor.
Okay, all right. So when you're hunting these kind of blocks of timbers, what's your strategy for like setting up your stands and stuff? Are you looking for, or do you mainly hunt over like those pinch points and the field edges, or the funnel change and cover, or are you looking for bedding areas, or what's your like go-to tactics that you're using?
Yeah, it really depends on what the piece offers. Like I'll use the piece that I hunt in New York as an example. There really isn't any cover funnel pinch points on that property. There's on that whole 170 acres that's a piece of private. There is probably, I'll say for argument's sake here, there's 50% of that is, huntable timber or brush, out of the 170. And in that, there's only one place that I would even call a pinch or a cover funnel or anything, and it's really not even a good one at that. So I have not personally found much luck because of the shape of the timber blocks, and just the shape of the ridge. How I described it as kind of a long parallel ridge lines. You don't have those spurs coming off of the ridge lines like you might see in like a western Wisconsin. If you pulled up the top of western Wisconsin and you see all these spurs and deep cuts and ravines, or even some places in Iowa, where they have those drainages and river systems and whatnot that are making so much more topographical changes. It's more of like a just a consistent straight ridge. And so I have not been able to find those quote unquote pinch points. What I have been able to find is travel corridors along that ridge, that 1/3 elevation down from the top of that ridge on the leeward side of the hill. They seem to like to run that wind tunnel area there where the thermals are coming up from the bottom as the sun warms the hillside, and the wind is coming over the top, and you get that mixing effect at that 1/3 elevation there. And I'm not the originator of that by any means. That's well known from guys like Dan Infault and such. But that is, you can ground truth that on a piece of property, and it is like darn near foolproof that there is going to be a runway at that elevation. If you have any kind of topography that assists that makes that the path of least resistance, like maybe an old logging trail right at that point, or maybe there's just a natural little bench in the side hill that they can walk along, it'll just make it that much more of a killer travel corridor right through there. So I've had good luck with that, and I've had luck with seeing them work parallel trails to the field edges, kind of more down towards the bottom of the valley, just inside of the woods line. Those parallel trails, you'll have doe coming out of the fields, going up into their bedding areas on the side hill. And oftentimes you'll have a parallel trail running the whole length of that field edge. And I've had luck with predicting that, okay, there's going to be a trail there. Now, I will say that those lower elevations are tougher to hunt with wind swirls, and I've personally seen them be much better for nighttime movement than daytime movement. So I'll set up cameras on those trails more often than I'll hunt those trails to get an inventory of what deer are on the property.
Okay, I'm going to pump the brakes on this one a little bit because I want to kind of double back. I didn't want to interrupt your thought, but
Yeah,
um,
yep.
can you explain a little bit? I hear that term now. I'm sure not everybody is familiar with Dan or Jeff. I've heard a bunch on them, and I get on some of the websites that they're on too. But I hear that term thrown out a lot, like leeward side.
Hmm.
Can you explain that a little bit better for people who might not understand? And then why do deer seem to like that? What's the draw for them there?
Yeah, and I think you're probably talking about Jeff Sturgis, like he's out there in Wisconsin, as well as Dan Infault. And he has some different ideas about, like, as far as like wind-based bedding and that 1/3 elevation than maybe Dan does. But I think a lot of their I believe, I'm not misrepresenting them, that a lot of their theories as far as deer liking to situate themselves looking downwind with the prevailing wind coming over their back, I believe that they both subscribe to some of that stuff. I know Dan does heavily. And Dan Infalt is probably, I'm, name dropping on him here, but he's very much responsible. I mean, I can't claim this stuff as like my original thought. Like, he's responsible for me really tweaking and revamping like my hunting strategies. So I just want to make sure that I'm not like coming across as trying to claim this, because most everything in life is inspired. So that's my disclaimer on the front side of that. But I think the theory is that the deer like to bed on the leeward side of the hill. So you have the side of the hill that the wind is hitting. It's coming over the hillside then, and that side hill where it's basically the back side of the prevailing wind is the leeward side of the hill. And the deer like to bed on that side hill, like with the wind coming over their back, because it's bringing any of the scent down from the top. So they can scent check behind them while they're laying in their bed. At that 1/3 elevation, once the thermals start to warm up and the sun hits that side hill, warms the air, the thermal currents are going to start rising because the warm air is lighter than the cool air. And so it starts rising up the hill. And you can feel this if you're hunting in the morning, like milkweed is the best way to see this, like the milkweed seed pods. You can see it in the morning where the weatherman will be calling for a north wind, and you'll be sitting in your tree stand letting milkweed out, and it's going to be drifting uphill to the south, which would be to the south in my scenario. And so that those thermals coming up and the wind coming over the top down to the deer creates a mixing effect about at that 1/3 elevation, where they can smell below, smell above. And what I found is on that military crest of the hill, before the top is kind of gradual and then it drops off quickly, they'll like to bed along that line, because they oftentimes will have a sight advantage looking down over the hill. So anything approaching from below, if they don't smell it, they can see it for maybe 50, maybe 100 yards, whether that's a hunter, a coyote, whatever. And then they'll be, just 2 bounds until they're up on top of the hill, and maybe there's heavier cover up on top of the hill. Maybe the side hill is a little more open, and then they can be into thick cover, just 2 bounds away from that security cover, but they'll bed on the edge of that cover. So those are some of the ways that they'll use back cover and prevailing wind coming over their back and the thermals coming up to kind of have one of those foolproof bedding setups that sometimes can be pretty hard to hunt, actually.
I want to touch on bedding here now that you brought it up. And I'm not even great with this myself, and this is something I'm trying to work on. That when you're out there doing your scouting and your boots on the ground, you come across these bedding areas. What's the best way to kind of determine, I guess, whether can you tell from a bed like what's a doe or family bedding area versus like a buck bedding area?
Yeah, you can. And I found one really good example of this, and I probably should have taken better pictures of it. But I was scouting a really small piece of public ground in South PA here, close to my house, that's archery only. And it was a side hill that came into like a bottom flat, and it was still timbered. And low on that piece, down in the flat, there was an area where it was just a big tangle, nasty thicket to get into it. And then once you were inside of it, it sort of opened up. It was kind of a cool spot. And there was probably close to a dozen beds and just droppings everywhere. And you could see hair in the beds. There wasn't any snow on the ground. This was late season. You could see hair in the beds, and you could see droppings everywhere. It was obvious that they were using it currently, but there was different size beds. There was some that were very small. There was some that were big, and the beds were actually, the leaves were depressed enough. Some of the beds were actually down to the dirt, but the leaves were depressed enough that you could actually see the shape of the deer's body, and it's almost like I described it like a half circle or like a banana shape, and you can see where that curvature of their back is. So you can actually look at a bed and determine which way the deer is facing when they're sitting in that bed. And in this particular situation, those different size beds, and then the beds facing in all different directions, that's indicative of, the quintessential doe bedding area, where they're bedded in a family group. There's different size animals, different age animals, and they're basically watching each other's backs. They're not that lone deer that's watching downhill, watching their back trail. They're sitting lower down in the bottoms with the swirling winds and everything, but they're using sight as much as smell in a lot of ways because they have so many sets of eyes that are watching. So that's easy to determine that. Where it becomes a little bit harder is when you find a lone bed, or you might find a place where it looks like there's maybe two beds. Maybe it's a little bench or a little point that's sticking out from the side hill, and it looks like there's two beds, and you go, well, there's multiple deer bedding here, so it's a doe bedding area again. And I'm admittedly not as good at doing this as what some people are, and it's just a thing of practice and kind of confirming some of your hunches, through hunting those locations and seeing what comes out of that bedding area that you found. But like Dan will talk about often, a buck doing a wind shift around the point of a little knob. So that wind is coming from the northwest, and it shifts halfway through the day to the northeast, and that buck gets up and he moves from, if you're following me, on the northwest wind, he's going to bed on the southeast side of that little knob, and then the wind shifts to the northeast and he moves over, and now he's bedding on the southwest side of that knob. And so you have multiple beds there, but it's really just the same deer shifting, and it might still be a buck bedding area. Another telltale sign that you're onto a buck bed is if there's a rub in the bed, or there's a rub close by to the bed, or a rub line leading in and out of that bedding area. Where I hunt, I'm not necessarily afforded those luxuries of seeing that kind of buck sign, because we don't have the age structure where that dominance is kicking in, and like that territorial side of the bucks, or we don't have tons of rubs in our woods. There might be one on that parcel that I'm talking about in New York. There might be one 3.5-year-old 120, 125 class buck running around, and the rest are a handful of 2-year-olds and 10 yearlings. And that might be the buck offering on that piece. Well, you're not getting the same kind of rutting activity and the same kind of sign making and all of that stuff. So you can't necessarily just say, oh, there's no rub here, it's not a buck bed. It still might be a buck bed. It just might not be that the bucks have to lay down the sign to quote unquote claim that, primary area that's, the best bedding on the property. So there's a bit of a margin of error in it. I don't want to act like there's not, but when you see something pushed up against, back cover, maybe it's a log, maybe it's a multiflora rose bush. Sometimes, depending on the steepness of the terrain, they'll bed on the upper side of a tree looking down the hill with the really steep bank offering them their back cover. Those kind of situations I'm cluing in on a little bit more as a potential buck bedding area, whereas those places down in the bottoms, more maybe right off of the food sources, those tend, where there's multiple beds, those tend to be kind of what I just put in as a doe bedding area that I might hunt, in the pre-rut or rut time frame.
Okay. So you've kind of, you're out there scouting, you found some bedding areas. Now we might have a good idea of what type, what kind of deer are bedding there. Is there any other information that you can gather while you're there to aid in your potential success for playing that area? Like I know, I think oftentimes that when hunters are out there scouting, they maybe bump deer out of a bedding area or they'll bump deer out of a food source, and they just kind of take that as, well, I bumped deer, so there's deer in this area, instead of
Hmm.
maybe investigating a little bit and figuring out why that deer is there, because I feel like a deer is in that particular area for a reason.
Right. Yeah. That no, that was absolutely that you're describing me to a T, not that many years ago. Um, I actually can remember a time when my dad and I were walking in archery season, and I don't recall. I halfway think like I came out like midday and for a break or something. I was going to go back in for an evening hunt, but I was trying to scout a spot that I wanted to sit in gun season, and so I walked over to the next ridge over, and it was mostly an open side hill, and there was just this little strip of cover that went between the field that was on the top of the ridge and the field that was basically on the bottom. There was about a 50-yard wide strip of cover that separated them running along the side of the hill. And we were walking along the top edge of this cover, and all of a sudden we get to the very last 10 yards of cover. It's kind of narrowing down to a little bit of a point with a little bench, and all of a sudden you hear this racket, and nice Pennsylvania representative buck for Pennsylvania, like 120 class, um, blows out of that thicket and down over the hill, down over the ag field, and into the next block of timber. And we could watch him for like 600 yards running across this open field that we bumped him into. And I was just like, well, that's crazy that a deer was bedded right there. Like, why would it, that's not even any cover. That had to be random. And I did not think about it again for over 10 years. And when some of this stuff started coming together, I thought about that spot again. And I went back, and in less than a minute of walking into that 50-yard wide strip of cover, was standing in a bed on a little mound of ground that was about a foot and a half higher than the other ground around it. And that deer could see out across the ag field, see the road, see any access coming up over the hill. He could even see anybody accessing the other block of timber across the road, across, 3, 4, 500 yards across the valley. He could smell anything that was coming over the top. That's how he blew out of the bed, because he smelled us coming over the top. And it was almost foolproof. Now, yeah, if I had a gun, I could have been throwing lead at him, but in that early season time frame, he was bedding there because he was completely undisturbed there. Everybody else was small game hunting or archery hunting in that block of timber across the road, completely forgetting about that. And so, I mean, I guess what I'm getting long-winded to say is that it doesn't always take the deer to be in a big chunk of timber. It takes the deer having the advantages like that you were alluding to, like they're there for a reason. Why is this a secure spot? And so what I want to do when I find a bed is I want to get down into that bed and look around and see what the deer sees first and foremost. Then I want to see how they're mostly exiting the bed. I don't care as much about how they're entering the bed because I rarely try and hunt an individual bed in the morning. I'm not good enough at doing that. There's some guys that can do it, and they're great and have a great success ratio at it. I just am not that skilled to be able to find that subtle trail where they're coming in with the wind in their face, entering that bed with the wind in their face, and finding that kind of J hook trail that they're using to come into there. That's just not in my wheelhouse. So I'm more concerned about how they're exiting that bed, going to like a destination food source, or maybe they're going towards a primary scrape area. Maybe that's pulling them in that direction. I want to see what the deer can see first so that I know how close I can get to that bed. Because where we're hunting, where you're hunting in, central New York up there, you're not getting more than, most times, unless it's a fluke, but consistently, you're not getting more than 100, maybe 200 yards of daylight movement from these bucks in the month of October. So that's, I want to know how close I can get for sight, sound, and smell to set up on a deer silently without being seen. And so I'm going to be looking for a tree that gets me as close as possible, that provides me maybe a just off wind. Maybe that wind is just missing that deer with the tree that I'm picking. If I'm going in for an evening hunt, I might pick a tree. I'm going to try and pick a tree that is below the trail that I expect that deer to be on, because my thermals, by the time that deer is getting to me, are dropping away from that trail. So I'm going to mark the bed with my GPS with a waypoint, and I'm going to try and mark a tree, pick a tree right then and there, and mark that with a waypoint so I can walk right to that tree. And then the last thing that I'm thinking about is, what is my access that I can get in here? Maybe it's early season. Maybe there's going to be more vegetation. Do I have to walk out around so that I don't disturb this deer and bump them out of the bed? So those are, 3, 4, 5 things that you're evaluating once you find that awesome bed that looks like a mature buck is utilizing on a regular basis.
Once you find that buck bed, what is your, so obviously you're trying to do everything to kind of stack the odds in your favor. What is there a time during the season that is most beneficial to hunt those different types, whether it be a mature buck bedding or a doe bedding? Do you play those differently, or you can, kind of at any point during the season hunt either one?
Yeah, I think that I would say that earlier in the season. Now, if you're talking, I'm talking like New York, Pennsylvania, Michigan, like I'm talking like those opening season dates, which are like on or around October 1st. Now, there's some states like North Dakota or something like that that would open in even August, before velvet peel, before you get that shift where the bucks break up their bachelor groups and all that stuff. That bedding is going to be completely different most of the time than what the kind of bedding that I'm talking about that they're utilizing into the fall. That more individual buck bedding with maybe some satellite buck bedding around it in less desirable or less advantageous places. So I want to qualify that first of all. But as far as hunting like an individual buck bed, if I have an idea that a buck is bedding in a specific area, I will try and go in and make kind of a surgical drone strike early in October, for that, before the hunting pressure kicks up and maybe alters those movements. So like on a piece of public or a piece of shared property, like what I hunt in Pennsylvania, I'm probably going to be a little bit more aggressive on some of that stuff because I don't have time to wait, because somebody else is going to mess it up. Not because they're buck bed hunting, because they're just walking through a prime area that they don't even realize that they're destroying a, potentially awesome hunting spot by just going right through, the bedding area. So I will try and go in pretty early in the season when there's still some semblance of a bed to food pattern, and try and cut that nighttime movement off. I'm not really hunting mornings at this point in time, and I've already before decided, okay, I'm gonna use early season to hunt, doe groups, and I can be less invasive, and more conservative. I can even sit a field edge to hunt a doe group where I'm at. I don't have to worry about bumping deer off of, food sources as much early in the season. The does will come back out the next night and try and pick off a doe early in the season. I've kind of gotten away from that now and don't really try and hunt does early in October, because the way that I figure it, and I don't claim to be a biologist or whatever, and this is, maybe somebody would tell me I'm wrong, but I want to keep the does on the property so that there is, an attractant for the bucks come rut. And then additionally speaking, to that, I like to try and gauge what the neighbors have shot as far as doe numbers that they've shot before I go and start blitzing a bunch of does off and then find out that they shot a huge pile of does. And so I'll kind of try and gauge what I've been seeing on cameras, as far as like doe groups, doe family groups, population wise, what the neighbors have shot. And so I'll wait oftentimes until later in the season or even into rifle season in New York, to take does. So when I'm hunting the doe bedding areas, it's oftentimes, in that like pre-rut time frame where I'm hunting a travel corridor in the pre-rut last week in October. That's when my cameras historically will kind of light up with buck activity. Like I have hardly any bucks on my cameras right now because we don't have any summer food on our property, and we can't compete with the ag. So we plan our food plots to kind of complement the ag. When the ag comes out, now our brassicas and our cereal grains are coming on strong, and then we see a shift onto our property in about that October timeframe as far as more bucks utilizing it. But I get the most daytime movement that last week in October, kind of cruising. I'll have some cameras set up on those travel corridors where they kind of come and cruise through, just kind of scent checking those doe bedding areas, early on. And that's where I like to sit my stands too. And I don't check those cameras unless I'm hunting basically over the camera. And I have like black flash cameras that are silent, and then I hang them high in the tree to not alter the deer movement with them. But that's how I hunt those doe areas, is mostly trying to capitalize on the buck movement around them.
Okay. So, I mean, it sounds like you're running quite a few cameras. When you plan your, we'll just say when you're planning this upcoming season, do you have target bucks in mind that you've already seen? I mean, you're saying that you're not seeing too many bucks, or
Mm-hmm.
do you mostly rely on that increased activity from the rut, and then you're aiming for an age class, or what's kind of your setup when you're looking for bucks out there?
Yeah, absolutely. The second thing that you said, like I have a few bucks that we will have consistent pictures of and decide beforehand if we're going to shoot them or not shoot them. And historically, you get those teeter totter bucks that I have an itchy trigger finger sometimes, and I like shooting deer and I like hunting, and I always tell people, like, if my heart starts pounding fast enough, they're getting an arrow or a bullet or what, it's make the decision. That I don't profess to be the end all be all of, like I'm only going to shoot 5.5-year-old deer. It's just not realistic where I hunt. And some people might say, well, go and find another place where it is realistic. I love hunting where I hunt. It's great, it's great deer numbers, great hunter opportunity. It's super challenging. It's a contest of wits. I mean, it's awesome to hunt PA, New York, throw Michigan in there if you want. I don't, because of that though, I can't sit here and say you know, I'm waiting for too tall. I just can't do that. Because I just will eat tags, so often, and that's not what I'm out there to do. I'm out there to have a good time, to enjoy myself, to put some deer on the ground. We eat the deer meat, like I don't, I've progressed on from shooting 1.5-year-olds. I don't want to shoot 2.5-year-olds anymore. I want to hit that 3.5-year-old age class. Like I said, sometimes I don't have enough self-control to let a real healthy, nice looking 2.5-year-old go by, depending on the circumstances. But that's kind of the goal, is an age class more than a hit list buck. That all being said, I don't have any pictures ever in July, August of good bucks on our property. That has been historically consistent for 5, 6, 7 years since I've been aggressively running trail cameras. Some of my friends will have awesome, beautiful summer pictures, full velvet pictures of just some giant bucks. And I always find myself like hating my life, thinking like, I'm never going to have any good bucks on my camera, blah, 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 every single year, because they're sending me these, mid-July. And inevitably, those bucks shift off of their properties when the ag on their properties comes out. And at about the same time, when the ag around our property comes out, I start to see a shift of deer onto our property. So that's the same reason why I don't get bent out of shape about summer buck pictures. And it's also the same reason why I do all my stand hanging. I like to have it done by the end of July at the latest. This year I was a little behind that. It was like the first day of August. But I'm putting all my stands in before those bucks that age group of bucks that I want to target is even coming back onto the property from their summer range. The way that I know what's in the area is I drive the roads every evening that I'm up around the property. I drive the roads with a video camera and get velvet footage of bucks when they're coming out in bachelor groups in the fields. And so if there's deer, within the surrounding area, within a mile of any direction, and I'm seeing a quality and an age class of deer that I'm happy with, I'm not too worried about them finding their way onto our property at some point in time in October, whether that's for cruising through for does in the pre-rut or the rut, or what have you. So that's kind of been my approach to like that hit list side of things.
Well, and I think that's probably how most people do it. It sounds like, at least, I hunt primarily public ground, so, my
Mm-hmm.
stuff's a little different. I can't run trail cameras where I hunt, so I wish I could. That I miss running trail cameras from my private land days, but it sounds like you're collecting some great information out there, and you like your area and you're working with the best you got.
Yeah, and the trail camera thing, if I can just say like real quick on that, the trail camera side of things, I think too many people try and use it to be like, I got a picture of this deer at this spot, so I'm going to go in and I'm going to hang a stand and I'm going to kill him here. Well, you got a picture of him coming through that spot when you weren't there, when you weren't putting the disturbance into the area, when you weren't putting your scent into the area, all of that. There's so many variables involved with that to begin with. But what I prefer to use my trail cameras for, and I like on the private piece I'm talking about, that 170 acres, we run approximately a dozen cameras, and give or take a camera or two. So it's blanketed, fairly good. When I started really covering that piece with trail cameras, it was not because I was going in there every week or twice a week to say, okay, when do I need to hunt this spot? Yep, he's coming through here now. That the act of doing that, it's like if you ever heard somebody talk about how observing an atom to measure it inherently changes the atom, because your act of observation actually like influences the atom, so you can't hardly get a good measurement of something that minute and small. Well, the minutia of deer activity and pressure and all of those details, like your act of monitoring them is affecting them and pressuring them. So I'll put cameras in that are soaker cameras that I don't even plan on ever touching until after the season, and I just want the data to see how the deer are using the area for the next year. And I found that to be way more valuable and beneficial than trying to use them to hunt the deer that particular year.
Yeah, that definitely makes a lot of sense. Well, Reuben, I really appreciate you coming on. Where can people find out more about you? I would recommend anybody, go to your Instagram account because it's full of awesome content. But if people want to come find out, more about you, where can they go?
Yeah, like you said, Instagram, Common Ground Bowhunter, Facebook, the same thing, Common Ground Bowhunter. I also put some YouTube videos up. Again, that's just Common Ground Bowhunter on YouTube. Like those velvet drive videos that I talked about making, I throw one of them up every summer, kind of a compilation. Have a couple hunt videos up there. Working on another one right now from last year. And then my email is commongroundbowhunter@gmail.com, and the website where I put some blog articles out and host most of the content that I do as far as the videos and some pictures and stuff is commongroundbowhunter.com. So pretty easy to remember. Everything's just Common Ground Bowhunter.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, and everybody, I encourage you to go check out the website for the articles and definitely hit up the Instagram because there's a lot of really good stuff on there. And Reuben, I really appreciate you coming on. I wish you good luck this season. And if you wouldn't mind hanging on the line for just a few, I'll get this stuff wrapped up.
All right, man. Good luck to you as well.
Yeah, appreciate it.
Thanks.
And there you go. Hope you guys enjoyed this show as much as I did. Special thanks to Reuben for taking the time out of his schedule and coming on the show. Please, again, go to the website, hit subscribe, add us to your RSS feed, add us to your iTunes. We've got a lot more great content coming out soon. I appreciate everybody, sincerely appreciate everybody taking the time out of their day to listen to this podcast. Until next time, take care and God bless.